For our next talk, we have Professor Amit Deshpande who will be presenting. Professor Amit is from Microsoft Research India, and he works in geometric and linear algebraic techniques and algorithms and complexity. He's going to be speaking on the topic sampling for subset selection and applications.
Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for organizing this wonderful conference and for inviting me. So I will be talking about sampling for subset selection. You may not know what it means. It might look mysterious and so on, but I will explain all these things. Secondly, because of my laziness, the slides are sort of recycled from some other talk that I gave. There may be, on some of the slides, there may be a lot of technical jargon, in which case it's my fault. If you don't understand it, it's not your fault. It's just because there is too much of technical jargon, and it's just that I was lazy to simplify the slides. Okay, first of all, I would like to know, so how many people have taken a course in linear algebra or are familiar with linear algebra? Okay, so I will assume some familiarity with simple things like, say, determinants of matrices and trace and eigenvalues, but I will give you some quick working definition, at least for the talk. So for any so this is, say, n by n matrix with real entries. So there are these things called as characteristic polynomials. Say it's a symmetric matrix. Then the characteristic polynomial is basically written as, it's a univariate polynomial in variable x, which is determinant of x times identity matrix minus a. Okay, and this has roots. Its roots are called as the eigenvalues of a. So it has roots, say, lambda 1, lambda 2 up to lambda n. So this polynomial factors as this. So this is something that we learn in basic linear algebra course. There are some extra things that we can find out about what are the coefficients. So this polynomial is a polynomial of degree n. You can also write it as x to the n plus c n minus 1 x to the minus 1 plus c n minus 2 times x to the n minus 2 plus c0. So this is writing the polynomial in terms of its coefficients. There is a relationship between these coefficients and the roots of the polynomial. That is also something we learn in high school algebra, that the roots of the polynomial, when you multiply them, there is a relationship between those roots and the coefficients. So there are some of these things which will be used for an application or multiple applications, and that's what you will see in this talk. So some of these things were simple things that I had learned as an undergrad student going through algebra, like basic linear algebra textbooks. But later they became useful when I was working on some research problems in a totally unrelated context. So I just want to give this as an example that you might find something in some textbooks which may appeal to you, but it might just be sort of a curiosity, a curious observation or a problem or something like that. But it may find very surprising applications in things that you right now may not even think of. Here I will be talking about a problem which comes from algorithms for large matrices. So the matrices are very large, and so this is the problem that comes up in many of the big data scenarios, that the data which, say, for example, is a matrix. I will give you specific examples of cases where the data happens to be a matrix, a large matrix, on which we want to do some sort of a computation. And the data is too large. You can't simply store it in the memory. And whatever you want to do, whatever matrix operations you want to do over the data, you have to somehow subsample the data and can run your algorithm only on this subsample. But you want to, and that is just because of your computational limitations. You can't, I mean, the whole matrix can't be stored in your RAM. It's sitting on a hard disk. You can only probably keep some part of it on the RAM. Or it may be the case that the matrix data is sort of distributed on several servers. You can only, while doing the computation, you can only take bits and pieces, do your computation on these bits and pieces. But in the end, what you want to do should resemble the computation done on the entire matrix. Okay. So why do we sample? Why does the question of this sampling subsets and so on come up? It comes up mostly in scenarios where the matrix is very large and we have to subsample parts of it, run our algorithm on this subsampled part, and from that infer something about the algorithm on the original matrix. The other thing that the other places where this comes up is in feature selection and dimension. So the data, the other problem that people always say about large data is that it has huge dimensionality. So I will give you an example, like why it is large and so on. And sometimes each dimension corresponds to a feature. So there are all these data items, and each data item is basically has multiple values. So these are like features. So you can always think of it as you have bunch of objects and you have bunch of features. Each object has multiple feature values, just that the number of objects could be in millions. The number of features could also be in millions. So one of the examples is, for example, document term matrix. So for all these web documents, you can think of each object as a document on the web and each feature as a word, and the value in the matrix is how many times the particular word appears in that document. So that is a document term, that is what is called as a document term matrix. But you could define various complicated such matrices. You have objects, you have features, and each entry of the matrix, so the rows are labeled by objects, columns are labeled by features, and each ijth entry of the matrix tells you how much the jth feature is present in the ith object. That's all. And once these matrices become large, you have this problem that either, I mean, the number of objects is huge or the number of features is huge, or both are large, and then how do you do computation over this? Say you want to do clustering, you want to do anything. Basically, you want to, what it boils down to is you want to pick a subsample of your data and run your algorithms on that. So that is where randomized algorithms come up. And randomized algorithms are also useful in a different sense, that they help you hedge your bets against an adversary. So I will tell you more as I go into the examples. So the outline is, I will tell you a little bit about this problem of low rank matrix approximation, and SVD is singular value decomposition. That is another thing that you may have seen in linear algebra, but I will tell you what it means. Then I will tell you a little bit about row and column sampling techniques for these matrices, and later I will tell you some more connections to other areas of mathematics. So this talk has as such nothing to do with Ramanujan per se, but I would like to, I mean, the main point here is applications of mathematics in other areas, okay, where you may, which initially you may not be aware of. You might say that while learning linear algebra, I mean, these are like, why should I learn these things? They don't seem to be useful in computer science or actually in programs and so on. So this is just to give you an idea of where they could be useful, and things that even I wasn't aware of when I learned them. So there are these, so these determinantal point processes is something you should look up if you are interested in. They have several applications in machine learning, and there is this survey by Kulesha and Tasker. So I have just given a link there to the survey. There is another application, but that is from theoretical computer science, so ignore the second thing for now.
Give equation?
Yes. Yeah. So here are, so where do low rank approximations come up? Or why are we interested in low rank approximations to matrices? So all these matrix data comes up in several scenarios. So there is one example here which is image data. So there is each pixel, so you can think of this as a matrix, and each entry has an intensity. So each pixel has an intensity which gives you a matrix, and you can then represent it as a, you can represent this image as a matrix. And it turns out that for most of these images, so this matrix data can be actually, so there is an underlying structure which is a low rank matrix, and then there is some noise. So for most of the matrix data, the structure is often a very useful way to model the structure underlying the data is a low rank approximation. So the rank of the matrix is the number of linearly independent rows or columns, the maximum number of linearly independent rows or columns in the matrix. And what that means is, if you want a very simple linear model, it would say that there are some, the rank is basically the number of rows or columns that are linearly independent, and all other rows are linear combinations of this subset of rows that are equal to the rank, or all other columns are linear combinations of a subset of columns. Okay, so that means there is a lot of redundancy.
Picture like this.
Yes.
You will have actually less number of linearly independent. The rank will be
Yes. So actually, for most of the images, if you compute just the rank 10 approximation, that is good enough. So for example, this is actually, this one is the exact image. So I took this image from the Mathematica software. So this gives, Mathematica software has something for image compression based on singular value decomposition. And this is the exact image, and this is the compressed image, which is just some rank 10 approximation. And you can see that there is hardly any difference. So this is the actual image. This is just the rank 10 part of it. I will tell you how to get the rank 10 part. And this is the noise.
You said it's subsets, right? It's a created out of subsets.
Yes.
Not about combining unions and things like that.
It's not about combining unions. So there is some subset of rows or columns, or basically it also says that there are some 10 vectors such that all the rows are linear combinations of these 10 vectors.
I was thinking something in the lines of basis for topology, not like that, right?
Like basis for the linear.
In some sense, but basis, but in a linear sense. So here is another example of, although this is not an example of large data, it tells you that the structure is often captured by a low rank part. But this is not large. I mean, images have a few hundreds by few hundreds pixels. That's not large. The large data comes up when, so there are several examples. Let me give you one example. And why, so even in the image data, it's not really needed that you have a subset of rows or columns that would span the others, so, or that would form the basis. Because the rows and columns don't have such special significance, but in some cases, these rows or columns themselves may have a special significance. So one such example is this thing called as gene expression data. So what people do is there are certain genes which are, I mean, some sort of substrings in the DNA samples. So substrings of DNA, and for each patient, you take the DNA sample, and so the rows are represented by DNA samples of patients, and the columns are represented by genes. Forget about the tree that is drawn here, that's not important for this talk. So the columns are represented by genes, and each entry, which is this, like it's color coded here, each entry tells you how much a particular gene is represented in that DNA sample of that particular patient. So the ijth entry here, in terms of its color, will tell you how much the jth gene is represented in the ith patient's DNA. And based on that, what people want to find out is
each gene is supposed to be there only once in a DNA, or it can be 10 times in different places?
no, once. So it's just a substring. You just want to know. So yeah, when people do experiments, they can't say that this is like with 100% it is there. Like what you get is some sort of a number that tells you that it's there with this particular gene expression is present in that DNA sample with probability say 90% or 80%. So from such a data, people want to know, so there is the data collected for some set of patients who have that gene or who have a particular disease and who don't have a particular disease. And what you want to know whether this data can be represented by 1 or 2 genes, or maybe at the most say 5 to 10 genes, like some subset of genes. Because in that case, you can say that these are the genes which trigger this particular disease. So that is where you don't just want low rank structure, you want it to be of the specific type that you want to actually find out which are the genes that are the distinguishing factors here, and the behavior of all the other genes in this gene expression pattern can be explained by this subset. So this is the most important subset. All the others are just linear combinations of these in some sense. Like linear model is like the simplest thing we can do. There could be more complicated ways of telling correlations, but this is a very simplistic assumption to start with. So let me tell you where singular values, singular vectors, and the singular value decomposition comes up. So in linear algebra, there is something called a singular value decomposition for every matrix. So every matrix can be thought of as a linear map. It takes a vector and gives you back another vector. So you have a matrix M. When you right multiply it with another vector, so M times some other vector, say X, M times X gives you a vector Y. So basically you can think of it as it's a map that takes vectors and gives you back vectors. Now what does it do? So one way is if you scale this vector, so if you have M times 2X, you will get back twice of Y, 2 times Y, right? So it scales with, if I scale the input, this linear map scales its output. Okay, so it's sufficient to look at what it does to unit vectors, like vectors of unit length. So what it does to, if it is acting in 2 dimensions, what it does on a circle, or in general on a unit sphere or the unit ball, what it does to a unit ball. So you have the set of all vectors that have length less than or equal to 1. Where does it map them? Turns out that actually if you map it, it maps the unit ball to an ellipsoid that looks like this. So in 2 dimensions it is an ellipse. In higher dimensions it's an ellipsoid. And singular value decomposition is just decomposing this map into, so M actually takes this unit ball to an ellipsoid, and the singular value decomposition is telling you how this map works, and in a sort of systematic fashion. What it says is you can decompose the matrix M or its corresponding linear map into 3 maps. First is a map that is a orthogonal transformation. So it sort of rotates the unit ball. So it has, the unit ball has some basis, it just changes. So the unit ball just rotates in some way. That's the first thing that happens. Then it takes the new, so it takes new coordinate axis. So it first rotates this unit balls. Now looks at the coordinate axis and scales them by different amounts and along different coordinates. And that is the mapping given by a diagonal matrix, which is here represented by sigma. sorry, so actually I did it the other way. So when you are applying m to x, x will first get multiplied with some v transpose, which is, so this is the first orthogonal map that will act on x, which will give this rotation. Then the second is a linear map which scales the coordinate axis along different directions by different amounts sometimes. And then there is another rotation of this axis now, which is given by u, so that the ellipsoid gets aligned along some direction. And singular value decomposition is just a way of writing this linear map M as a decomposition into 3 maps. So this is the geometric picture of it. Linear algebraically, what you can say is, when you rewrite this whole thing, so if you have u1, u2, and so these orthogonal transformations, they have ui's as their columns and vi's as the columns of v. So then you can write it as, you can write M as sum of multiple rank 1 matrices, where each matrix is given by some vector u1 times v1 transpose, then u2 times v2 transpose, and so on. So rank 1 matrices are very simple matrices. They are so we just have this u1 times v1 transpose. So basically this matrix is just writing down different scalings of v as per the coordinates of u. So all that singular value decomposition does is writes, and then there is an extra sigma, which is here, it is sigma 1 times this, and so on. So singular value decomposition can also be thought of as not a decomposition of maps, but a sum of rewriting the given matrix as sum of these different rank 1 matrices, and the corresponding sigma i's, which in the geometric picture correspond to the lengths of the principal axes of these ellipsoids. If you write them down in decreasing order or non-increasing order, it turns out that the top k of them, or the top few of them, they capture the structure in M, and the rest is not so important. You can throw it away as noise. So if you do this for image, if you actually write down M as this decomposition and take the top, say 10 rank 1 parts, that actually explains most of the things in that image. The rest can be thrown away as noise and you don't lose much.
So reverse calculation will get the image back.
Yes. Yes. If you do the reverse, you will get back the image with that extra part.
Without the noise.
Yeah. So you don't lose any information. By doing this, you are losing some information, but in most cases, the hunch is that the top few things explain most of the behavior of your data. Okay. Now I won't tell you how to compute this decomposition, except that I will tell you that it's easy to do it. There are several algorithms that do it. If you take any mathematical software package, it has routines for computing singular values, singular vectors, this singular value decomposition, and so on. Okay.
Suppose I have one picture.
Yeah.
In display, I write like this.
Yeah.
If I do this decomposition, will it throw that line out?
So it has just diagonal. So it will throw away only some of these.
In this picture,
You just have diagonal.
Like this. That's all.
Yes.
So if I do this singular value decomposition, take the top 10 or whatever is that.
Mm-hmm. So
the points corresponding to this, will they be treated as noise and thrown out, or will they?
No. They will be very important.
No, so this will capture that.
This will capture that, but not as a whole. If it is just a line, it won't capture that as a whole, but it will capture
only one curve like this.
Yes. Yeah, but it will capture only curve will be very difficult to capture because, say for example, if I have a picture which has only a diagonal which is black, diagonal pixels are black, everything is white, it has high rank. if I take any low rank approximation,
If it is a curve.
yes, so it will,
One curve.
this will pick only the high intensity pixels along the diagonal. So it will tell you which ones are the highest. It will pick only those highest ones. So it will keep the diagonal, only that part of the diagonal which is higher in intensity.
No, but then,
If all are equal, it will throw. No, I mean, I have to throw away something, right? It will keep only some representative bits, which is still okay. I mean, it's not that bad. It's still giving you the diagonal in parts. Yeah.
How does this decomposition make sure that the first top 10 cover, the first top 10 are the major part of it?
So 10 is not not the most. Yes.
Your example that. So
But
how are the top few covering the whole essence of image?
how does that happen?
How does
So
it-
that is something observed. That's an observation people have made about image data. That image data essentially is low rank. Like you can, at least for these kinds of, like for most kinds of images, the structure in the image is captured by the top few components.
Probably it has something to do with the brain and that a meaningful picture.
So it has something to do with the physics of the camera.
Well, not just that. The question is,
To some-
camera can pick it up, but I think what is meaningful to human beings is intrinsically low dimensional. In that, I'm pretty
Maybe.
sure you can
Yes.
synthesize an
So-
image where it is uniform,
Yeah.
where all the sigmas are equal.
Yeah.
But it probably doesn't mean anything, and we won't recognize that as a meaningful image.
Yes, that's true. So, or sometimes, yeah, so, yeah, it depends on what you mean is meaningful. But the other example I can give is sometimes in the context where, say, for audio signals, and you can think of like as in when we generate something, our voice is generated by some small number of components, like in our body. So for anything that is generated, if you have a model which has small number of components that generates it, it cannot have too much of complicated patterns. It needs to have some sort of redundancy inbuilt into that. And most of the times such things can be captured by low rank approximations.
Okay, there's only one you can address it at
That's-
an appropriate time. By suitable generalization of plus and into, you can make this a nonlinear SVD.
Sure.
Now, I don't know where you would try to use that, but then you'll have to generalize what is meant by matrix multiplication and things like this.
Sure, or you can define your matrix in a different way. That is another thing you could do. You can take the non-linearity into account by defining what is the entry. What are the entries that you want? So this actually tells you that it also means that you can write. So suppose your image were of low rank, then that means all that you have to keep is. So then you could write it. So there are two options: either to keep an n by n matrix, or to keep, say, two matrices which are n by k and k by n. Say if it is of rank k and k is much smaller than n. So sometimes if n is, say, so if this is million by million and k is 10, it's easier to keep two matrices which are million by 10 rather than keeping one matrix which is million by million. So in that sense, it's a compression, or it helps reduce what you actually keep or run your algorithm on.
In a lot of practical situations, this choosing the scale is left to the user, I guess.
Yes,
because
yes.
you can
So
say
here,
how much of precision do you want?
Yeah.
You can say that the 98% precision gives you what you require. Then in that case, you can actually choose your K.
Yeah.
Right? You need not.
yes. So that is up to you. So there are these. So here, I have rewritten whatever I told you so far. So the matrix is, say, some n by d, and so this singular value decomposition is defined for even rectangular matrices. So this is what actually generalizes the notion of eigenvalues and eigenvectors, because eigenvalues and eigenvectors we define only for symmetric matrices, whereas singular value decomposition is a generalization of that, which can be defined for any matrix. Like any linear map can be decomposed this way. Just that in the previous slide, for symmetric matrices, both these ui's and vi's will be length n vectors, and for an n by d, which is not a n by n matrix, not a square matrix, you can have the singular value decomposition where this is ui's are all length n vectors and vi's are all length d vectors. That's all. Okay. So the other thing that turns out geometrically is I told you about these document term matrices and so on. So typically all this matrix data can be thought of as a bunch of objects. Each object has multiple features. So whichever way you look at it, either you can think of the rows as points or the columns as points. And for each, so if you think of rows as points, all these values that they have in the column can be thought of as coordinates. And you can think of each row as a point in a high dimensional space. Similarly, if you think of the columns as points, each column gives you a point, and the values written for that column, all the values that it has, they can be thought of as coordinates, and you can think of this column as a point in a high dimensional space. Now what does low rank approximation actually give geometrically is there are all these points in a high dimensional space. The dimensions could be million. We want to find a linear subspace, which is, say, the simplest example is we want to find a line that fits this data. Okay, and the line, say, goes through the origin. I have the data somehow centered and so on. Say the line goes through, so I have a bunch of points in high dimensional space. I want a line that fits this data. By fitting, let's take a very simple notion of a fit, which is what is called as least squares fit. So I want to minimize, say, the sum of squared distances of all these points to this line. Then what is the best line? Turns out that the best line is given by the top singular vector, that direction. So if it is an n by d matrix, and I'm thinking of each row as a point, so they are all points in d dimensions. There are n rows, d columns, so each row has d coordinates. So each row is a point in a d dimensional space. Turns out that the best direction that sort of the best line that fits is just a line in the v1 direction. Similarly, the best plane that fits in terms of minimizing squared distances is the plane spanned by v1 and v2, and so on. This is true for any k in general.
So if I have say, billions of documents,
yes,
and let me assume that my feature vector, each feature is a word,
yes,
and typically let me assume that normally 5,000 words are the maximum,
yes,
if you go with
sure.
English. So if I want to know a subset of words exist in document, instead of checking through each document, if I have this SVD or whatever is that one, I'll be able to get
a subset of words.
I give the input as that subset of words, and will I get the respective documents which are most likely to have those words?
No, not really. So that is one problem. So I will tell you what the problem with SVD is. So SVD, for example, it says that, so it will give you the best subspace that is that approximates the data, but there is one problem with it. So for example, for the gene expression data, so it also fits the example that you gave, but this is probably a good way to illustrate what goes wrong with using SVD. So it's also called as this singular value decomposition also has a name in machine learning which is called as PCA. So principal component analysis, that essentially it centers your data and then computes the singular values and singular vectors. I'm just telling you what it means geometrically and linear algebraically, nothing else. It's just the same. So the problem is, it will tell you if we give it this gene expression data, it will say that this can be explained by the top, say, 3 singular vectors, and each of the singular vectors is not a gene but a linear combination of genes. Yes, and that has a problem in terms of it has no meaning for the biologists. They will say, so if you tell a biologist that I will give you million genes and this particular linear combinations of them causes this disease, that information is useless for them.
Which gene exactly is what they want?
Yes, what they want is a subset of genes, not a linear combination with these coefficients. They cannot do anything with that. So there are 2 drawbacks. One is that this SVD computation takes, so I haven't told you how to compute it, except that I told you that most mathematical software packages would have an algorithm, and it runs in time polynomial in the size of your matrix, and the polynomial is like nd squared or n squared d, the minimum of these 2.
But if I have this million genes you take,
Yeah.
so let me take, for example, my objective is to find out where the diabetics related gene or whatever is there.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, there are most of the genes are, say, most of the people's one, they are not diabetic. So, if I have a collection of data, okay, with diabetic and non-diabetic,
Yes.
still will I be able to use this linear combination stuff?
So linear
This
combination.
linear combination
Yes.
stands for the non-diabetic fellow.
Yes. Yes.
So if any
So what it will give you is, it will say that take this particular, it will give you a particular linear combination, and it will say that the if you take the linear combination of these corresponding coordinates for diabetic patients and non-diabetic patients, they will be separated. Yeah.
so I may be able to arrive at such conclusions.
Yes, you may be able to arrive at such conclusions. It will just say that this subset,
Okay, this will, like suppose
these linear
the
combinations.
Data, I choose the data of say normal people,
Yeah,
about a million or a billion.
sure.
So I get a principal value decomposition of this.
Yeah.
Now I take a new sample. I don't know, a new sample also if I do this. And if that principal value matches with this, then this new sample is a non-diabetic.
Yes, yes.
If it doesn't match, then it is diabetic.
Yeah, you could do such
That
things.
type of-
Yes, yeah. So there was one problem with the singular value decomposition, which is that it takes a long time to, in the sense the algorithm runs in polynomial time, but not I mean, for large matrices that could still be impractical. So some of the things that people want to do is what is called as dimension reduction. So somehow, instead of computing the rank key approximation for not an n by d matrix, but some n by t for some smaller t, if we could do this, then the computation time would come down from nd squared to n times t squared, right? So if it is for say n by n matrix, say n, it was a square matrix, if we could reduce one of the dimensions considerably, then we get considerable improvements in the running time. So there is a result which came from convex geometry, which came from pure mathematics, but now it is used everywhere in problems on large matrices in applied areas. So it's a result by Johnson and Lindenstrauss. What it says is you multiply your matrix, given matrix, with a random matrix with Gaussian entries. There is some scaling, just that this random matrix is d times t, where t is log n over epsilon squared, where epsilon is some parameter that you choose. If you do that, and if you compute the rank key approximation of a times r, then in terms of the error that it had with the actual data is not too far from the actual best rank K approximation had to the actual data. So it approximates that very well, and the additional advantage is that we have reduced one of the dimensions from D to T. There is a matrix multiplication that we have to do, but after that, when we have to compute the singular value decomposition, instead of it being an n by n matrix, it will be an n by log n matrix, which is much easier to compute your singular value decomposition on. So instead of that nd squared, where d could be like n, in which case earlier the running time for a square matrix, n by n matrix, was n cubed, n times n squared, which was n cubed. Instead of that, this is n times log n squared, which is much smaller. And this helps a lot of computations done on large matrices, and people use this now everywhere. In fact, there are faster algorithms for doing this Johnson-Lindenstrauss. So the faster algorithms want to do a matrix multiplication not with this random matrix, but something else, which is say sparse, or which is easier to multiply A with. So there is a lot of work going on about making this step faster. But there is okay. So but in this talk I will tell you about something else which is simpler, which does something very simple with the matrix.
F is what, Frobenius norm?
Yes, F is Frobenius norm, which is actually for the errors it meant geometrically, it meant sum of squared distances to the subspace. So F is this Frobenius norm, which is basically take the entry-wise differences of two matrices. So the Frobenius norm distance between A and its approximation that we are trying to find is entry-wise differences squared up and then sum over all the entries. So there is a simpler technique which you can do. So for rank K approximation, so this is a result by Fries, Kandan and Vempala. What they showed is you could do something very simple. You just sample the rows of your matrix.
Any matrix, as long as it is of that size.
It's a random matrix with IID Gaussian entries.
With the entries being
These standard normal variables. The entries are all standard normal variables with a scaling factor, and they are all independent. But you could also take a random plus minus 1 matrix. So take a D by log n matrix. All the entries are random plus minus ones, and there is a scaling factor that you have to but the scaling factor is uniform for all the entries. So it's just a random signed matrix. Yes.
So that means that instead of instead of AK, I can use ARK.
Yes. So instead of using your singular value decomposition algorithm on A, you use it on A times R. That's all. You first multiply with a random matrix and then run your algorithm on this. So there is another way to achieve this, which is the squared length sampling, which is you sample K over epsilon rows of, so this epsilon is what tells you what the error is.
That will help because here also I am ending up with a K matrix
Come on.
by R. How will that help me?
Because one of the dimensions is lower. A times R is not an n by n, it is n by log n. So if you use your singular value decomposition algorithm, which runs in n times d squared, so earlier it was running in say n times d squared, and d was as large as n, which means it was n cubed overall. Instead of that, now it's n times log n squared, which is very small. So the other thing is the squared length sampling, where you sample rows of the matrix with probability proportional to their squared length. So you just compute the squared length, which is just sum of squares of the coordinates, that's all. And you sample the rows with probability proportional to that, which means higher length rows will get picked more often than rows which have lower lengths or have mostly zeros in them. So if you pick them use their span, as in, so you pick a subset of these rows, find a basis for the span of them, and then project onto them. So this matrix also will be, it will be, instead of, this will also reduce one of the dimensions from n to k over epsilon. And then you can run your singular value decomposition algorithm. And even that achieves the same thing as Johnson-Linden-Strauss. So this was sort of a surprising result, and then which started a lot of work in this direction. So intuitively it, okay, so so the second one has k over epsilon. This is like if k is even smaller than log n, if n is like, say, really huge, millions or billions, log n is also going to be, it's not going to be small but not so small, and there is also an epsilon squared sitting there, like 1 over epsilon squared. So say epsilon is, even if it is say 0.01, then this will be 10 to the, like 1 over epsilon squared will be 10 to the 4. It will still be large, right? So there are these two things that help. So this is k. So if you want something like still a rank 10 approximation or rank 5 approximation, it gives that. And secondly, it actually gives you a subset of rows, which helps in cases like the gene expression data. But this is a randomized algorithm. Yeah, both of these are randomized, so they give, this guarantee is like with high probability. So there is, as in, if you want to if you want to increase the probability of success, what you have to do is you run it multiple times and then take the best. So to get a probability of say 1 minus delta, you have to run it like log 1 over delta times, which is not too bad. I mean, this dependence is logarithmic in 1 over delta. So these randomized algorithms are like, they are very good for large matrices.
Yeah, just one
Yes.
comment. It's effectively the L2 norm. Now the question is, depending on the physical system, the L2 norm may not reflect accuracy. In that, for example, I would not be surprised if in gene expression data, some trait depends on some very subtle combination of genes,
Yeah.
which would be which would not be visible in an L2 norm type of analysis. So suppose I take any general convex function, or if do you have similar results? Of course you can say, can I take a general non-convex function? That would be too hard. I don't think there will be any results you'll get.
Yes, but for convex functions, I am not aware of any results. I mean, these are the, it's still, as in, we don't know how general this technique is. So I will tell you some generalizations, but not so general as convex functions. I will tell you some problems that this does not address. So one of the problems is that this additive error is still bad, and it depends on the Frobenius norm squared of the original matrix, which is sum of squares of the entries of the original matrix. So if the original matrix has lots of large entries, this term is going to be really large. Okay. And the epsilon that you need, and this is the error that you have compared to the actual answer. So if this term is going to be large, it's going to kill you, because to make this term small, you have to make epsilon small, and the smaller the epsilon you make, this is going to go up. So actually there were some improvements over this, that some of them that I was involved in, and there are some, there is also other work done using some techniques from graph sparsification. So if Nikhil, so in Nikhil's talk you might see some of the ideas where people, so they were used for sparsification of graphs. By that they mean, so every graph has a corresponding matrix called as Laplacian, and for every graph they wanted to get a sparse graph whose Laplacian matrix approximates the Laplacian of the original graph. And there also, in a sense, you can think of it as subset selection, because the original graph has lots of edges. Instead of that, you want to keep only a small number of edges. So if there are n nodes, they can have potentially n squared edges. Instead of that, you want to keep only some constant times n edges, say 10n edges in this in a new graph, so that the Laplacian of this new graph, which is sparse, still approximates the Laplacian of the original graph. And
what is the physical meaning of the Laplacian?
so physical meaning of the Laplacian is
Circumstance I can use this.
so Laplacian comes up, for example, in random walks on graphs. So any algorithms that use random walks on graphs, or it preserves. Okay, the other thing I can tell you is it implies. So actually, it is stronger than what I am going to tell you. So it implies that this sparse graph will preserve all the cuts in the graph. So although there is a caveat in the sense the sparse graph will have different edge weights. So the original graph, if it has all edge weights uniform, say they are all ones, the sparsified version of it, the edge weights may not be uniform, they are different. But it is similar to the original graph in the following sense. If we take any cut in the original graph, which is we divide the nodes into two parts, two disjoint parts, and we look at the number of edges that go across. Then if you take the same cut in the sparsified graph, even though it has small number of edges, the cut size, which is number of edges going across, that remains within 1 plus minus epsilon.
I say this way that I have the original graph.
Yes.
There are say 5 clusters in that.
Yes.
Suppose.
Yes.
Now if I take the sparsified graph,
It will.
I get that these clusters are subsets of the original clusters.
Yes. So the cut values will be the same.
The cut
Will be roughly the same, but the number of edges is much smaller.
number of edges.
So it sort of keeps the essence of the original graph in terms of cut values, and actually much more. Can do much more things, but it was sort of motivated by the problem of approximating cuts, but actually ended up giving much more than just preserving cuts. It gave a lot more in actually it gave a lot more in computer science and gave back to mathematics. Yeah, so you might see some of these things not directly, but they're indirect applications in Ramanujan graphs in Nikhil's talk. So the other thing that has happened in the last few years is that people have found algorithms that are based on sparse versions of Johnson-Lindenstraus lemma, which is the random embedding, the random projection for dimension reduction. So people have found faster algorithms for that, which have given faster algorithms for low rank approximation. They don't give subset of rows or columns, but as algorithms for computing low rank approximation, they are much faster than running singular value decomposition on the original matrix. So one place where this fails, the idea of just picking things picking rows according to squared lengths, is that, again, think of this as, so in image search, so there are these documents corresponding to images, okay, and you can again think of them as vectors using whatever feature model that you have in your image search algorithm. So there are these few images corresponding to, so there are all these images are corresponding to jaguars, but two kinds of jaguars. So if you do squared length, if you pick vectors, and this is just sort of a diagram to give you an idea of how things may look like. So these are vectors in high dimensions. Some of them actually points to jaguar, the model of a car, and some of them point to jaguars, the animals. And suppose it is the case that a lot more of them point to cars, and they are also large in length, and there are some more there are a few of them which point to the animal, and they are sort of different in the sense they are orthogonal to each other. The features are so that they are orthogonal to each other, or they are very different from each other. So then if we do squared length sampling, we will pick only vectors from this cluster. We will fail to pick vectors from this cluster, the other cluster. So squared length sampling is bad when it comes to picking diversity in the data. It will just pick the most important directions, but it won't capture the diversity. So that is why there is something else that we can do. So turns out that so one of the generalizations of the squared length sampling is called adaptive sampling, which is you pick some number of vectors according to squared lengths. Then the next time you do the sampling, you do sampling based on squared distance from the span of the first few vectors you have picked. So you don't, the first time you pick these, their span will look like a line in this direction. So next time when you pick, it will be according to probabilities with square, not with squared lengths, but squared distance from the current span that you have. So all these vectors will have very low probability of getting picked. These vectors will have higher probability of getting picked. So one could do this iteratively, and that is what we call as adaptive sampling. The other generalization is actually a probability distribution over subsets. So you pick a subset of vectors with probability proportional to not, for a single vector it was squared length, for multiple vectors it's squared volume of, so if you take a pair of vectors, they form from the, so if you pick a pair of vectors, they form a triangle at their endpoints. So there is origin, and these are 2 points which I am also thinking of as vectors. They form a triangle. So we could pick a pair with probability proportional to squared area of the triangle. Pick triplet with probability proportional to squared area, squared volume of the simplex that they form. Or say you could extend, maybe not just triangle, you could take the parallelogram. That is another thing. So in general, the parallelogram will have, there will be a scaling involved, but it will be the same scaling for all pairs. It will be twice the area of the triangle. If it is square, it will be 4 times, but so on. So you could pick a subset with probability proportional to this squared volume of the parallelepiped. Turns out that that corresponds to a very interesting distribution, which is the following. You have a matrix. This corresponds to something very interesting. So you have, say, a matrix which is n by n, and it is positive semi-definite, which means all its, if you pick any subset of rows and the corresponding subset of columns, and if you take the determinants of those submatrices, they are all, their determinants are all positive. So in such cases, you can define a distribution over subsets. So we have a positive semi-definite matrix. Now we can define a distribution on, say, pairs of points. So this is n by n. Now we are defining a distribution over pairs ij. The way we will define the distribution is you pick the ith row and the jth row, ith column and the jth column, look at the corresponding entries I, j, j, I, and j, j. It will be a 2 by 2 matrix. You take its determinant, and that is what gives you the probability of picking this pair. So this is actually, it might look really crazy, but this is what helps in, so it in the end turned out for us as the right generalization of the squared length sampling, which also sort of helps with picking diverse set of vectors. And turns out that even though, so for an n by n matrix, you might say that there are n choose k such submatrices, and if we have to sample subsets from this, we might have to choose, like we might have to do, we might have to compute k by k determinants for n choose k submatrices, which will take time n choose k times k cubed, which would, you might say that it might look like the total running time for such algorithm may look like n choose k times k cubed, which is something like n to the k, at least there is an n to the k involved, right? N to the k times k cubed. So turns out that that is not the case. You can actually do it in running time. Just in the end you can do it in running time something like n times k cubed, and that comes from the fact that that comes from the fact that initially I told you about the characteristic polynomials. That it turns out that if you have so I haven't told you how this positive semi-definite matrix is related to that n by d matrix. It is actually just that matrix n by d times its transpose. So if it is A times A transpose is the n by n matrix, and on which we are picking these subsets of size k. And turns out that if you take the sum of squared volumes, it has a nice interpretation in terms of a symmetric polynomial of the singular values of that matrix. And that happens to be a characteristic, a particular coefficient in the characteristic polynomial of A times A transpose. So all of this comes from the fact that these singular values are actually eigenvalues of A times A transpose, and if you do the if you expand out the determinant, you will get some sum of determinants which are actually, they correspond to the squared volumes of subsets that we are picking. So overall it turns out that this computation of determinants, or the sampling according to the squared volumes or the determinants of submatrices, that can be done because of a nice linear algebraic fact. It can be done very efficiently because of a nice linear algebraic fact, and that can be exploited a lot more. I will tell you a little bit about so that's what helped in making the further improvements beyond the first result of Rees, Kandan and Vempala. The other thing is all such these the distribution that I described, which is we are given an n by n positive semi-definite matrix, and we using that we can define a distribution on size k subsets of 1 to n, which is basically you pick some subset of rows, you look at the same subset for the columns, you look at the corresponding submatrix, take its determinant, and that gives you the probability for picking this subset. This models several other interesting distributions. Like if you are given a graph, there are a spanning tree is a subset of edges, so that all the nodes are connected and there are no cycles. If you want to know what is the distribution on how do I pick, say, a uniformly random spanning tree, there are multiple spanning trees in the graph. Can you pick one of them uniformly at random for me? Turns out that that can also be done using this linear algebra technique. Although there are now faster algorithms for that, but the first algorithm for that was based on this. So such distributions, they come up a lot in random spanning trees. Similarly, such subdeterminants, they have nice interpretations in terms of joint distributions of eigenvalues of random matrices and so on. If you are more interested in this, you can search for something called as determinantal point processes, and there is a whole lot of work done in pure math as well as machine learning on these. With that, I will skip all these other slides actually. So yeah, let me stop there.